Hi, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. Today, we are going to be talking about the ends justifying the means. We have this very interesting concept of ati aseh v'dachi lo ta'aseh. A positive commandment can override a negative commandment. We specifically see it on Menachot 40a, Mem Amud Aleph, regarding Tzitzit, because the blue techelet is actually semer, it's wool, and you could be wearing a pishtim, you could be wearing a linen garment, and nonetheless, that is permitted. Okay, so the question really is, what is the logic behind this, and how does it connect to rabbinic thinking in general? So I want to, before getting into the logic of it, I also want to look at the limitations of it. There's a very interesting Yerushalmi. Um, there's a very interesting Yerushalmi in Chala, Perek Bet, Halakha Aleph, and it's talking about something that we might not think of. When we look in Yehoshua Perek Hey, we find that the people come into the land, Vayachanu b'nei Yisrael b'Gilgal. They're living in Gilgal, meaning they camp in Gilgal, Vayasot Pesach, B'Arba'asar Yom L'Chodesh, very exciting. They've just all given themselves circumcision to the men, and now they're able to do the Korban Pesach on the 14th day of the month, Be'erev, Ba'arvot Yericho, in the evening, on the plains of Yericho. And the next day they ate from the produce of the land, Mimacharat Pesach, the day after they gave the Korban Pesach, matzot v'kalui, matzah and parched grain, be'etzem hayom hazeh, on that day. And you got to wonder to yourself, wait a second, we actually know that there's a halacha of chadash. There's a halacha of not being able to eat grains that have been grown since last year when the Korban Omer was given on the 16th of Nisan until the Korban Omer is given this year on the 16th of Nisan. So what exactly did they use to eat those matzah? Sounds like they used stuff that they had grown there, but it was before the Korban Omer. So how were they allowed to do it? So that's kind of the background of what's going on in this Yerushalmi. We have Rabbi Yonah by Kome Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yonah asks Rabbi Yirmiyah, or asks before Rabbi Yirmiyah, "B'sha'ah shenechnusu Yisrael la'aretz umatzah kama lecha, ma'u shetehei asura mishum chadash." Was there actually a prohibition of them eating new grains that had been grown since last year after the 16th of Nisan because there was no Korban Omer given yet, right? And the response was, Lama lo, why not? And then the conversation goes, Kachani Omer, he says, well, then lo yochlu Yisrael matzah b'leilei Pesach. They shouldn't have eaten matzah the first night of Pesach because the new Korban Omer hadn't been given and they were eating from the produce of the land. So then we find out, Amar Rabbi Yonah midinafkot. When I left, I realized I should have said to him, actually, Shan Yehi, this is a different situation. The positive commandment of having to eat matzah should override the negative commandment of not being allowed to eat chadash. And then the Gemara says, well, actually, al date de Rabbi Yonah, do Amar mitzvah below taseh, afal pisha inaktuva betzida nicha. That only works, according to Rabbi Yonah's opinion, that a positive commandment can override a negative commandment, even if they're not written on the same side. Now, what does written on the same side mean? Some people think written on the same side means written back to back, the way that don't wear Sha'atnez and wear tzitzis are written literally back to back. And it seems like Rabbi Yonah thinks aseh dochelot aseh, even if they're not written back to back. Other people think that written back to back actually it doesn't mean literally next to each other, juxtaposed in the Torah. It means written on the same side of Sinai. In other words, be'erev tochulu matzot, the mitzvah of eating matzah, is already a mitzvah that they got before Har Sinai. But the lo taseh, the negative commandment of not eating chadash, is something they only get after Har Sinai. So an aseh from before Har Sinai cannot override a lo taseh from after Har Sinai. Interesting in and of itself, is that saying something about the lo tasehs after Sinai being weightier? Is it simply they're not on the same side and therefore unclear? But either way, Rabbi Yonah seems to think that's not a qualification, but others do. Al date Rabbi Yossi, but what about Rabbi Yossi? Do Amar ein mitzvah aseh dochel mitzvah below taseh ela im kenai taktuva b'tzida, right? So according to Rabbi Yossi, though, he would say, sorry, aseh dochel taseh is not carte blanche. It only applies when they're actually either written back to back, for those who explain it that way, or written on the same side of Sinai, so to speak. So basically, he said, okay, mashiyu tagare goyim mochrin lahen. It must have been that the non-Jewish merchants sold them the food to make their matzah from, right? Or Uka Rabbi Yishmael, or maybe it was like Rabbi Yishmael who says this actually comes later. But what I want you to see is that, we really see it in the Bavli as something that is just normative. And in the Yerushalmi, it's a little bit more contested. Another thing that we actually do see in the Bavli is that while it is true that an asay can override a lo tasay, it cannot override something that is a double whammy. It can't override something that is itself both an asay and a lo tasay. Now, is that a quantitative issue? One going up against two. Is that a qualitative issue because you have an assay going up against another assay, and we're okay with going up against a lot assay, but we're not okay with going up against an assay, right? But an example is the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah talks about how you cannot violate Yom Tov for the sake of shofar, right? Shofar shel Rosh Hashanah ein mavirin alavet atchum. You can't pass over the tchum. You can't go the 2,000 amot, 3,000 to 4,000 feet beyond your uh, uh, what's settlement, right? On Yom Tov to go to your shofar, and you can't lift up rubble to get a shofar from underneath. You can't go on you can't climb up a tree. You can't ride on an animal. And you can't go sailing across the river. You also can't cut a shofar to prepare it. Bein bedavar shehu mishum shvut, whether we're talking about something that is a shvut, which literally probably means it's not written explicitly, but we call it a derabanan, bein bedavar shehu mishum lo taseh, or it is a lo taseh, a negative commandment. Either way, you cannot do it for the purpose of shofar. Now, why not atiyaseh v'dachi lo taseh? A positive commandment can override a negative commandment. Well, my time says the Gemara, what's the reason? Shofar asehu. It's true. Shofar is a positive commandment, but Yom Tov is an aseh and a lo taseh. Yom Tov has connected to it a positive commandment of keeping Yom Tov and a negative commandment of not violating Yom Tov. Ve'ein aseh dochet lo taseh v'aseh. And an aseh cannot override a positive and a negative together. Again, is that quantitative? Is that qualitative? Hard to know. We could also talk about other limitations like an aseh overriding a lo ta'aseh sheyesh bo karet, right? That incurs excision. But I think that's just at least to tell us that this actually is something that, though the Bavli looks at it as normative, it definitely has limits placed on it. So let's talk about the logic. I think in order to talk about the logic, we've got to return to the psukim of Lo Tobas Sha'atnez Tzemer Vishtim Yachdav in Devarim Kaf Bet. You should not be wearing Sha'atnez, wool and linen together. And then right after that, the next pasuk, Dilim Taselach, you should make tassels for yourself. And by the way, you just have to notice how, Tzitzit could mean a sprout and Dilim is something grown. Like there's something, I think there's nature imagery here more than I've ever thought about it before. Al arba kanfot ksutcha, on the four corners of your garment, asher techaseba, which with you cover yourself. So the Mechilta notices that we have a few things that we would say were said bidibur echad. The Mechilta, of course, is Midrash Halakha on Sefer Shmot. It's Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael is from the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Yishmael, even though it's called Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael because it's the first term. He's the first one to speak in that Mechilta, as opposed to Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, which comes from the Midrash of Rabbi Akiva, where Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is the first to speak there. But either way, we have Zachor Yom HaShabbat L'Kodsho in Yitro. Zachor Yom HaShabbat L'Kodsho. Remember the Shabbos to keep it holy, to keep it separate. And then you have Shamor at Yom HaShabbat L'Kodsho in Va'et Hanan. So Zachor v'Shamor Shnehem b'Dibur Echad Ne'emru. They were both said together. And then the Mechilta goes through other things that actually, b'dibur echad, they're said together, but they're kind of opposites. Like you would think that there's a conflict between them. So, mechalaleh hamot yumat, one who breaks Shabbat is supposed to get the death penalty. Oh, is supposed to die. I actually shouldn't say it like that. Should be put to death. And then we also have uvi yom hashabbat shnei chvasim b'nei shanat mimim. On Shabbat, you're going to be giving two lambs. So you explained to me, Shneim Namru B'Dibur Echad, how are you supposed to do that without breaking Shabbat? Don't worry, they were both said together, meaning the exception is built in. Likewise, Ervat Eshet Achicha Lo Tegaleh, right? The nudity of your brother's wife you should not uncover. And yet, Yivama Yavo Aleha, if a man dies childless, the brother is responsible for performing yibum, levirate marriage, if the woman wants. Shnehem ne'amru b'dibur echad. Shouldn't that be a violation of sleeping with your sister-in-law? Well, again, there's an exception that was carved out. Likewise, for our example of tzitzit, lo tilbash shatnez, don't wear wool and linen together. And then gedilim tasalach, make tassels. Shnehem b'dibur echad ne'emru, right? They were said in the same gasp, so to speak. Which a person would not be able to do. Shenemar, as it says, Achat diber Elokim, Shtaim zu shamati, ki oz le'Elokim. Right? God spoke one thing, I heard two things. This is God's strength, right? Ve'omer, and we also have the pasuk halo chod divari ke'esh. God says, my words are like fire. Ne'um Hashem ukipatish yivosets sela, like a patish that breaks the rock, meaning sparks come out, meaning more than one thing is heard. What seems to be indicated here is not that you really have an atiyaseh v'dachilotase, or not that you have when it comes to Shabbat and let's say the Korban Tamid, right? That's not an aseh and a lo taseh, right? We're in a different category there. But you have I mean, it's a lo taseh sheyesh bo karit, but you actually have the exception is actually built in, right? That doesn't feel like what we're talking about is a dechia as much as we're talking about the exception is actually built in. And for those who think about ase dochalot ase as less of a dechia, as less of an overriding and more of a hutra, now it is permitted because the exception is built in. They might be looking at a more expansive version of what should be permitted via atiyaseh b'dachilotase. For example, would I say, let's say somebody wants to do a mitzvah, not that they had to do, but they just want to do something that's not obligatory, okay? So, for example, let's say somebody wanted to wear tzitzis at night, but kilayim, but mixed fibers, tzitzis at night. You don't wear tzitzis at night. I mean, there's no obligation to wear tzitzis at night, right? So Rabbeinu Tam says in number 7, Tosfot Menachot Mem Bet, Rabbeinu Tam dahachi nami hashmi'ina dahafilu balayla ein ba mishum kilayim. Even at night, there's no kilayim. There's no mixed fibers problem of wearing tzitzit. Afagav delav span tzitzit. So even though it's not the time of tzitzit, dilagamri hitira katuv kilayim shel tzitzit, because scripture permitted completely, right? Tzitzit is an exception to the Avera of Kilayim, right? Tzitzit is an exception to an Avera of Kilayim, right? So there's a way to look at it that it is exceptional as opposed to there's this fight that's going on. Now, when you look at the Ramban, actually the Ramban ala Torah, it seems like there is a little bit of a fight going on, but the fight that's going on is not about rule and exception. It's actually about the significance of an aseh, right? So the Ramban says, "Be'emet hu gamkein ki midat zachor." I think it's ramzo, like it's remez, is b'mitzvah aseh. When we say zachor yom Shabbat lakodsho, it is a remez. It is a hint to positive commandments. V'hu hayotze midat ha'ahava. And that comes from the attribute of love and for the attribute of mercy. Because one who does what one's master wishes of them becomes beloved to them and the master has mercy on them. Umidat shamor b'mitzvat lo taseh. And when we talk about shamor, like shamor yom Shabbat lakodsho, right, guarding Shabbat, v'hu l'midat hadin v'yotzeh midat hayirah, right, that is about the attribute of justice, and it comes from the attribute of fear or awe. Ki hanishmar me'asot davar ra be'enei adonav yareoto, right, one who keeps from doing something that their master considers problematic, clearly fears or has awe of their master. And therefore, an aseh is qualitatively greater. A positive commandment is qualitatively greater than a negative commandment. just as love is greater than fear. Because one who actively uses their body and their possessions to do the will of their master, that's better than somebody who just passively doesn't do the wrong thing. And that's why Chazal said positive commandments can override negative commandments. Now it sounds like it's it's hard to tell if he's saying that both ahava is greater than yirah, love is greater than awe or fear, or he's really saying the love aspect requires you to do something active, and that being active is actually what's greater than just not doing the wrong thing, right? It's greater than do no harm, but or maybe it's some combination of both. But for the Ramban, it doesn't seem to be there's no lotase here. It's definitely a dechia, an overriding of the lotase, but the assay is so important that the essay is so important, right? That it overrides. Now, interestingly enough, the funny thing is, like, you get punished for a low tasse. So why are you getting punished for a low tasse if ase is actually really more important? Well, he says, well, it comes from the character of the thing. Well, lo tasse is actually already in the realm of din. It's in the realm of justice. It's in the realm of prosecution. So if you transgress it, you get malkot, you get lashes, you get, God forbid, death penalty, right? Ve'eno sin bo din b'mitzvah aseh klal, right? We don't do din when it comes to mitzvah aseh. If you're mevatel and aseh, if you don't do a mitzvah aseh, you're not punished for it. Ela b'mordin, unless you are actively rebellious. Kimo lulav v'tzitzis ein yosef. Somebody says, I refuse to do lulav and tzitzis, or sukkah ein yosef, I refuse to do sukkah. Sanhedrin, you makin oto ad shekabel alav lasot. Sanhedrin would hit you until you would accept upon yourself to do it. Oh, I should say nafsho, or, God forbid, until somebody died. But the point is, he's basically trying to say, like, these are two very separate ways of worshiping God, and we would not have din, we would not have any sort of judgment or punishment in the realm of asay. That's not really where judgment should live, right? That's coming from a whole different midah, a whole different attribute, right? So that's a different take on this issue. It's not an exception carved in. It's telling you something about assays versus lo assays in general. And what we might be talking about here is not hutra. It's not totally allowed. You might not be allowed to do it if you're talking about tzitzis at night, right? It's really because when it comes to the clash, the assay wins in the clash, right? There's another way to look at this, which I think is like totally quantitative, and it's fascinating, and I don't really know what to do with it, but I'm sharing it with you because it exists, right? So there's a pasuk in Shemot Perikaf Gimel. We just read it last week in Parsha Mishpatim, right? Uvachol asher amarti alechem tishameru v'shem Elohim acherim lo taskiru v'lo yishama al picha, right? Everything I've told you, be on guard, right? And the rest of the pasuk is about not saying the names of pagan deities. So Rashi says, what is this tishameru? Uvachol asher amarti alechem tishameru, right? Everything that I've said to you, be on guard about it. Lasot kol mitzvah aseh ba'asara, shekol shmira shebatorah asarahi b'makom lav, right? So shmira in the Torah, guard in the Torah always means negative commandment. And what it's saying is every mitzvah to say has a negative commandment attached to it. And the Chizkuni, 13th century France, says, yeah. As hara l'chol mitzvah to say, every mitzvah to say has a lo taseh attached to it. Like Rashi says, mikan amru b'chol Talmud aseh docha lo taseh. This is why we say a positive commandment trumps a negative commandment. Shahari b'chlal aseh, because every aseh yesh lo lo taseh imo. It actually has, there's a typo here. I'll have to fix that before we put it up, but it has a lo taseh along with it, right? So it's like, because Tisha Meru, right, is the language of lotase, right? So it's almost sounds like it's quantitative, like it almost sounds like it's quantitative, which is a very different, right? And then you could imagine to yourself, what about when an assay goes up against an assay and a lotase? Well, now it's even, so you can't actually, better not to do anything than to go actively do the mitzvah and override. But those are already three different approaches. One approach that looks at the lotase the assay as an exception to the general lo assay, another as the assay overriding the lo assay because assays come from ahava and they're that much greater. Whereas lo tasses come from yirah and they're not, and another is to look at it in this kind of quantitative way. Okay. Now, it is possible, I think, really in all of these, it's kind of possible to see, you know, maybe make an argument that what we're saying is now the lotase is completely mutar, right? So I don't, the difference between is it hutra or is it dechuya is not really going to affect me right now, but I am curious, and this is something I saw in Rav Moshe Lichtenstein's writing on this topic. I am curious, like, what is it that actually causes the assay to be able to win out, right? So I'm particularly interested in what happens if somebody wants to do an assay just to be makayim a mitzvah, just to actively do a mitzvah, but it's not a mitzvah that they're obligated to do. Can they still violate a lo taseh for that? Right? Meaning it's the question of is what causes it, and this is the way Rav Moshe put it, to my understanding, is what causes it the fact that there's a kiyum mitzvah, that there's a possibility of doing an assay, and that overrides a lo taseh no matter what? Or is what causes it the fact that you're between Scylla and Charybdis because you have to do the mitzvah assay, right? So it seems the Kovetz Shiurim by Rav Elchanan Wasserman, very important 20th century Talmid Chacham murdered by Lithuanian Nazi collaborators in 1941, along with, I think, 11 other rabbis, and had some stirring words to say before he was murdered, actually, that you can look up online. It says, Midivrei HaRaavad, according to the Ravad, Mivu'ar Didchiat Aseh Lelo Taseh, Hi B'Shvil Kiyum HaMitzvah Grida, that actually just fulfilling a mitzvah is a good enough reason to violate the lo taseh, afilu hecha doleka bitul mitzvah klal, even where if you hadn't done the mitzvah, it wouldn't be considered nullifying the mitzvah. Kimo b'mitzvah aseh shazman grama ben nashim, like a time-bound commandment for women, right? Which Chazal, a time-bound commandment for women, they do not think that that is a requirement. And according to those who say, but women can do time-bound commandments, let's say there was a situation where the time-bound commandment would actually violate a lo taseh. The Raavad says you can still do the aseh. It's about the kiyum mitzvah. Rabbi Akiva Eger on the other side disagrees. Da'ato b'pshitut, he thinks very clearly that the chia he rak im titbatel ha'aseh. The only way you can override a negative commandment is if not doing the aseh would be a problem. V'lo b'shvil kiyuma, it's not just enough to be able to do the aseh and do something positive. Okay, so that itself I think is very interesting, and it does speak to my mind, to the Ramban's view a little bit. The Ravid's view speaks to the Ramban's view a little bit, because if the Ramban is saying the assay is so important and doing me'ava is so important that it should override a lo taseh, which is just me'ira, I can understand why even if you're choosing to do a mitzvah that you're not required to do, that kiyum mitzvah, it's okay if it overrides a lo taseh because you're still doing that positive me'ava, right? Whereas I think, let's say, from the perspective of um, is this lo ta'aseh, is this assay actually an exception to the lo ta'aseh in general? Maybe that's only if it's an obligation. Unclear, but you could probably read the Ramban that way also, right? It's hard to necessarily line these things up, but worth thinking about nonetheless. I just want to do one more thing because I think that there are a lot of examples within Chazal where we talk about ends and means, and one other place, as I don't remember if I mentioned it, but one other place we talk about it is mitzvah babi avera, that you are not allowed to, let's say, steal a lulav and use it for the mitzvah, right? That is a problem. That is a mitzvah babi avera. It is a mitzvah that is done at the cost or is done through making through a transgression. How is it different from aseh docha lo taseh? There are a lot of opinions on this, but I want to bring one, and it's from the Ritva. The Ritva makes a distinction between something where the clash is automatic, such as kilayim and tzitzit, meaning if you want to be able to wear tzitzit with techelet, by definition, you are going to come across the lo taseh, the problem of Sha'atnez, right? And that's what we say an aseh overrides a lo taseh. Whereas if you choose to steal a lulav, That was your choice. Nobody forced you to steal a lulav, right? That was your choice. It's not the system doesn't set up the Scylla and Charybdis for you. It's you just set it up. And if you set it up through your pshia, through whether it's your negligence or your poor behavior, we're not going to say, yeah, go ahead and do that mitzvah, right? That's not really what we want to look at. Now, like anything else, we'd have exceptions in the mitzvah b'avera rule, like anything else. But just to start, like broad strokes, thinking about it, where the system gave you the oxymoron, we figure out what to do. Where you created it yourself, we're a little more suspect of you. So maybe to be continued, people want to go down this rabbit hole. Professor Nachum Rackover wrote a great book called Hamatara. I'm going to get the title wrong, but Matara Mekadeshet et Ha'emtzaim, when the ends justify the means or the goal justifies the means. And he's not even talking about this. He's talking about Aveira Lishma, which is one of those in case of emergency break glass, like Yael sleeping with Sisera in order to save the Jewish people. Um, the doing an Avera for its own sake. So if you want to go down the rabbit hole, worth checking it out. Thanks for learning with me, everybody, as always.